You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. I am here with Mr. Brett Newcomb and intern Michael.
Hello again.
Good morning.
How are you guys doing?
Great.
Very well.
You guys are, I guess I should say, consummate professionals.
Yes, I think you can
Because-
safely say that.
You can say
I've
it.
always said
The
that.
shenanigans that were going on before we turned the mics on were raucous. And then the mic goes on and you guys are like...
I'm much more well behaved when the camera is on.
It's the Sunday paper rule. Never
Yeah.
put it in writing unless you want it to end up in the Sunday paper.
Exactly.
That's right.
That's
Yep.
true.
Don't say anything that you don't want somebody to shout with a megaphone in the local mall.
Yes, dear.
Yeah. Although now malls are...
Empty.
Yeah.
Going out of business.
It's amazing. So how can the economy be running so hot and yet have just facilities that sell stuff going out of business left and right?
There's this really cool new invention. Came out in the 90s or so called the internet. And people have
What's
been-
this internets that you speak of?
Well, everybody has a box in their house, and when they get sad or lonely, they get on the box for several hours, and advertisers show them pictures, and then they buy things for dopamine hits. It's great. It's going to be the next big thing.
I think Al Gore had something to do with that.
He invented it, actually.
All right.
I think Amazon has had a lot more to do with it than Al Gore.
Yeah.
With the changes that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So happy I could support Jeff Bezos riding into space.
He's flying that phallic symbol all the way to the moon.
Just jealous.
We're along for the ride.
I am jealous because I want to go to space.
Ah.
But I'll never have that kind of money, so... I'll miss it by just a couple of years probably. Like 3 years after I die, space travel will be affordable that I could have done it, but I'll be dead.
Well, now you've spoken it and manifested that into the world, so that's your own fault.
So, yeah, I got nobody to blame but me. So, I wish I could be more clear,
I do too.
but I struggle with that. You've been telling this story all day. Well, this...
Use your words.
Yeah. You've been talking about this phenomenon all day where I will start multiple sentences and build this large narrative rather than just answer a simple question. And I feel like that this subject is very apropos for that.
It's a reflection of reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have, for the last year, been really, really into reading Jung. So reading original Jung, like not reading things. But one of the things that
Well, it's kind of like reading the Bible.
Yeah,
Do you actually read the Bible, or just read stuff people say is in the Bible?
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Because I feel like there's a lot of literature out there in psychology, which there obviously is, but what happens if you go back and you read the original stuff that the original person, like if I decided that I wanted to be a Jungian therapist, call myself a Jungian therapist, then the psychoanalytic community here in St. Louis would say, well, you can't be a Jungian therapist because you haven't gone through our classes and been officially sanctioned by us. But the truth is, how many of them have read Jung's original work? Probably not very many of them. They've read a lot of stuff that people have said about Jung, just like I feel about Heinz Kohut. A lot of people have read a lot of stuff that people have said about Heinz Kohut, but how many people have gone back and actually read Heinz Kohut's original work? So I've really been trying to pay a lot of attention to Jung's original works, and one of the things that I am very aware of is that a lot of what I think people think they know about Jung is not accurate.
Say more.
Okay, so Jung, so the types that Jung came out with, and that now are manifested in the Myers-Briggs, or are, explored through the Myers-Briggs. There's very little of what Jung originally wrote that actually supports that. So that doesn't mean that what the Myers-Briggs tests is necessarily wrong, but I don't know that Jung would have necessarily supported the Myers-Briggs in its current iteration. I don't know. Maybe he would have, but it didn't exist when he was alive, and so we don't know what he thinks about it. But a lot of people would tell you that the Myers-Briggs represents essentially the principles of Jung's typology, and maybe it does. I don't know. I don't know what Jung would think about that, but I do know that he was very specific about what
But what you're talking about is a distinction between the manifestation of his theory,
yeah,
and the origination,
yeah,
of his theory. And your argument is, if you go back and read what he originally wrote, then you have a clearer understanding of his thoughts.
exactly.
But as I understand it, when he wrote this stuff, it was coming out of his intellect, not scientific experimentation. Brilliant man. Conceptualized these things, wrote them down. The Myers-Briggs is someone else taking that and trying to interpret it or develop a mechanism that would evoke it when clients take a test.
Right.
So they're not the same thing, but they may be different facets of the same diamond.
Yeah.
I think that's
Exactly.
the political scientist in you here. It's that we're saying that law is the manifestation of philosophy, but the philosophy is not born to the end of law most of the time.
Yes. Got that.
So one of the things that Jung wrote about that I would like to explore is this concept of clarity. So I sent you guys an article about Jung's thoughts on clarity, and so I would just ask you, what was your guys' thoughts or reflections about that?
Michael, you want to?
Sure. I have always looked at Jung's clarity going back to Stoicism, right? We talk about Marcus Aurelius, know thyself. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in this, and how we interpret this, and how we can use this to better our lives, or to connect with people around us. In my everyday job, right, as an engineer, I will get into not tiffs, but confrontations with a teammate of mine, because he's very wordy, right? And the more words he uses, the less I understand about what he's actually saying. And I think Jung's argument here is, if you don't know yourself, how can anybody else know you? And to get to the point where other people can know you, or you can enact that, get really deep with yourself and understand what you are, what your convictions are, and what you want them to be. I think there's wisdom in that. I also think there's wisdom in understanding that you, even like knowing them is different than choosing them, and you can do both. You can do both.
So what would you say is the difference between the knowing and the choosing?
I would say that knowing a conviction that you currently hold, for example, my father is relatively religious.
Yes.
I think he knows that conviction of himself, but it wasn't until much later in his life that he really wrestled with his own faith. That did he choose that conviction for himself?
So you could be brought up in a family where a conviction were indoctrinated into you, and it could be something like racism. You could have been indoctrinated into a racist family, and you could have that as a part of you, but you hadn't chosen it. And then if you actually look back and at yourself critically and say, is this an aspect of my personality that I want to embrace? You could choose not to. You could choose to change.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
okay.
think Jung falls in that camp as well. Not only can you choose to change, but you have a responsibility to make the choice. It falls back in that stoicism, or even back to the aristocracy of, I have the responsibility of knowing myself, of understanding this philosophy in myself, because eventually, as a human being or a member of society, I need to make the choice.
Okay, I thought you had some. But so for me, this is from the psychodynamic perspective, the real distinction between what they call catharsis and cathexis. So catharsis is the evocation of a strong emotional reaction. Cathexis is like an epiphanal understanding into the true nature of a thing. And I have always believed that cathexis is the goal of therapy, at least for me. If I'm going to go to therapy, cathexis is my goal, and I try and create cathexis for my clients. But I've had a lot of people tell me that cathexis could be a goal, but is not a necessary goal of therapy. So do you guys think that better personal understanding is a required goal of therapy, or should be an expectation of therapy, or do you think that just alleviation of symptomology is the goal or the point of therapy?
So I think that depends on if we're talking about therapy as an intellectual exercise in a field of study, or if we're talking about what the client coming to see you is hoping to achieve. Because they're the ones that get to decide.
So it's really in service to what the client's goals are.
It should be. But then there's also a pure intellectual description that you can buy into as a therapist, but I don't think you can impose it on the client. I had dinner this week with an old friend of mine who is struggling with some things in her life right now. And she was saying, I was raised Lutheran. I feel these shoulds about how I should be certain ways. And I'm discovering at this point in my life I don't want to be that way. And so I'm feeling guilt about it. She said, talk to me about guilt. And I said, my personal belief, because I'm not doing therapy with her, so I'll talk more about what I believe with her, is that guilt, the feeling of guilt, is an imposed script that was internalized inside you in your early childhood. Messages that you were given to try to control your behaviors, your options, and your thoughts. Remorse is something totally different. Remorse is something comes out of my own personal sense of integrity. To be the person I want to be, as I understand it, requires me to behave this way, think this way, feel this way. So if I'm not behaving in the way, if I idealize myself, for instance, as a good Christian, how do I understand the message about Christianity and Christ? It says, well, you should behave this way. Oh, okay. So I want to behave this way. But then I'm walking through the mall and I see somebody that I immediately just want to go slap. I have a visceral sense of antagonism to this person. I don't know where it came from. I just feel it. The primitive part of me wants to go punch him in the nose. When I recognize that, the Christian part of me, or the integrity part of me, is saying, well, wait a minute. A good Christian wouldn't have those feelings, wouldn't respond to those feelings. What the hell's wrong with you? You're a sick person. So then I'm in conflict internally between the person I'm now seeing myself to be and the idealized person that I would wish to be. So what I try to explain to my friend is I make a distinction between feeling remorse. If I did or didn't do something, I drive down the highway and these people are standing on the side of the road with homeless signs and little children, a woman, a man, and a couple of little children. And I think, can't believe that the city hadn't run them off. They're interrupting traffic. It's dangerous. They shouldn't be there. Then I drive half a mile on and I think, what if they're really homeless? What if those little kids are hungry? You got some money you could have given them. What's wrong with you? You're not a good person. So I get caught up in those conflicts. So then I ask myself, who do you choose to be? Do you choose to be a person who tries to help the downtrodden? If so, how do you do that? Do you support a food pantry? Do you support a homeless shelter? Do you physically go down and cook meal? I mean, what do you do to say, well, I'm helping? And then can you discriminate between that and passing somebody on the highway with a homeless sign as a matter of personal choice? So we get into the shoulds. And what I told my friend is, the way I try to distinguish this with clients who are suffering from this is, can you make a distinction between the have to shoulds and the choose to shoulds? The behavior may be the same, the visible behavior. I'm going to put $20 in a pot somewhere. The have to should, if I listen to that and I do it, the way I'll know, I'm going to feel resentful and angry. The choose to should, I'm going to feel good about, because my superego will come in and give me an attaboy. Oh, you did the right thing. You did what we wanted to do. So I try to make the distinction between the have to shoulds and the choose to shoulds.
But so then the only way that you can know the difference between the have to shoulds and the choose to shoulds is to find this clarity.
Clarity, absolutely, which brings us back full circle to you.
So I want to go back though and ask you a question about while I was listening to this. Well, actually, let's go to our break and then we'll come back and I'm going to ask you a question. Hey, Brett, if you were going to tell somebody to check out something on the internet to help them with their mental health, what would you tell them?
I tell them, listen to Psych with Mike.
Why would you tell them that?
Because it's probably one of the most easily listenable experiences you can have that will give you information that's useful for a whole spectrum of concerns that people have.
I agree, and I have actually been told that by at least a dozen people, several of whom were not married to me, and some of them didn't even know me.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. It's when we get that kind of feedback from people, it is so incredibly humbling and overwhelming for me.
It is for both of us.
Yeah. So we really appreciate it, and as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back, and so the question that I wanted to ask you is: so, do you conceptualize guilt as an external message and remorse as an internal message?
No. I conceptualize guilt as an indoctrinated message.
Okay, so but that's what I mean.
Internal.
It's coming from outside. The message is coming from outside
Originally,
you.
but I've internalized it.
But I've internalized it. Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But remorse has to come from inside.
Right, from my own developed sense of integrity. The person to be the husband that I want to be requires me to behave this way and not behave that way. So even though the primitive me may want to behave that way,
right,
the chosen me shouldn't. It's a should. But is it a have to should? Is it coming from my religious training as a child? Or is it a choose to should? It's coming from my sense of grown up integrity. I walk this path because I choose to walk this path. It makes me feel better about me.
So would you say that remorse is more a function of clarity?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Because I think that's really helpful when thinking about, we've all treated individuals who are sexual abuse survivors.
Right.
And we've always had, and we've talked about this multiple times. You come to Thanksgiving, I got to go to.
Doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the perpetrator.
But I think that that's a great way to be able to present that to the client, to say, you feel guilty, but do you feel remorse?
So that's what you have to do. You have to break up the script that they've internalized and offer them the option to write a new one.
Right. Because if you feel guilty, then that's pressure that's coming from you from outside, from other members of
the rest of the family still wants to keep the imagery in place. And so they're going to be really devastated if you out Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving dinner. Right. You ruined our Thanksgiving.
Right. And so if I say to the client, let's not focus on your guilt, let's focus on your remorse. Where's your remorse come from? My remorse comes from that I couldn't protect that little girl. My remorse comes from that my other people in my family didn't protect that little girl.
Well, and so that wouldn't be remorse. That would be anger.
Well, I mean, it could be. Yeah, I mean, it could.
If
Johnny didn't protect Susie, I don't own any of that.
It's regret, not necessarily remorse.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Here, I think, is that they're both rooted. They both gain power through shame.
Yes.
I think both guilt and remorse, and even regret, all three gain their power through an unspoken shame.
Yeah.
But but where's the shame coming from? Is it coming from an external message or is it coming from an internal message?
Right, the whole personal integrity. So that's the conversation I want to have with the client. What is your sense of integrity? Not my judgment, not my external observation saying good girl, bad girl, but what do you see when you look in the mirror? What do you hear in your head? And I think that's what Jung was suggesting in the article about clarity of self-awareness, self-perception, self-examination.
Michael, you were going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. So, have you ever used that terminology, though, in therapy? I would like for you to have more clarity.
No.
Yeah, I haven't either.
No.
Have you ever conceptualized it that way in a way that you were aware of?
I don't know.
Okay, because I think I do that. I think I do, and I don't know that I ever used the word clarity, but I tend to be fairly Socratic, and there's a whole controversy in psychology. Should you be Socratic? Should you teach in therapy, or should you let the client come to their own conclusions? And I tend to be more Socratic, and that's just how I am, and so I know that about myself. But I want people to genuinely come to an understanding of themselves, not one that I've given them or projected onto them, but one that they internally believe is true, because I don't think you can make accurate choices about your behavior and how you want to be if you don't understand that.
So what I try, you're talking about a teaching moment or a teachable moment, what I try to do is teach a client that words matter, and that it's really important if we can get to the manifestation of the script that they hear in their head. What are the words that you hear? With my friend, what she was saying is, I hear should. And so I said, could you work on changing? Every time you hear should in your head, stop and say will or won't. I should take my friend to dinner. Stop and say, I will take my friend to dinner this week, or I won't take my friend to dinner this week, and let that go. And re-script the words you hear in your head. Because I believe if the script is rewritten, the message changes.
We find that there's a powerful effect. This reminds me a lot of Danny Kahneman again, right? Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky have this whole idea of framing and language frames, right? And they would say people are much more effective at quitting smoking if they say, oh, I'm not a person who smokes.
Right.
Rather
or I'm not
than,
smoking today.
Right.
Yeah.
You say if you pull that into your identity as a person, it becomes much more powerful.
So so then that's a choose to should.
Yeah.
So we're focusing on this idea of clarity, and we're connecting it to those choose to shoulds.
Well, the clarity comes, as Jung says, the clarity comes from self-examination and self-reflection. So when you can examine the language of the script, then you can edit it to your liking.
Right. Okay. So now this is kind of blowing my mind, but okay. So one of the things that we struggle with in therapy all the time is the client who is struggling to be able to conceptualize themselves as a good person or a bad person. So using what we're talking about here, how do we apply that to help the client with that kind of struggle? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so. I think my approach to that would just simply be to ask them for more clarity, definition of how they experience them as bad, how they experience themselves as being bad and unworthy. And so what they will tell you is they've had this behavior, that behavior, or they'll tell you that their church says they should do this, that the shoulds from other message points. And then you start to take those one at a time and just examine them. Where does it come from? Is that yours? Do you own that? Or did somebody hand you that?
Well, I think that coming from, the old Albert Ellis kind of rational emotive therapy, messaging, unconscious self-talk, that a lot of what I see as the affliction of our society in Western culture is unworthiness, unlovableness that people are carrying from those pre-verbal years. And that we go back to, we were talking in a previous episode about the unthought known that we've learned from Michael Garanzini, and that is one of those really profound, deeply rooted unthought knowns. I am unlovable. And that, looking at this idea of clarity, what I would say to that client is, what makes you unlovable? Is this a message that you've internalized from your environment? If you really believe that about you, what is it about you that you think?
So the way I understand, Garanzini used that in connection with something called attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
Your ability to have attachments, to make relationships, to be connected. A lot of the pain that people experience and the dysfunction that they experience comes from their feeling of not being securely attached, not being safely attached. And so you have to spend enough time to get to that messaging. What did you hear and learn about your worthiness to be attached, about your expectation that you will be abandoned, cast out because you're unacceptable? And that didn't come into your head the instant that you were born as a tabula rasa, the blank tablet. That was written by someone on the wall. Like the biblical message about the finger of God writing a message on the wall. Somebody wrote that on your wall. Can we examine it? Can we possibly edit it? And if we can, what does that suggest to you about relationships, about self-acceptance, about self-worth?
Because if you got a message from your family of origin, from your primary, so I think this is what I believe is that you are born into a family, that this family demonstrates appropriate emotional regulation to you. You internalize that message of a regulation, but the effectiveness of that internalized process is really based on the extent to which you feel secure and attached. And so when you don't have good, secure attachment in those early years, it's going to be really, really difficult to develop effective emotional regulation later in life. And so then now you're an adult coming to my office telling me that you don't feel loved. And what I'm wanting to say to that person is, where is that coming from? If we go through a process of delineation to try and figure out clearly where that message comes from inside you, where do you see yourself being unlovable? And clients will always have examples. Well, this person says this.
Messages they were given.
Yeah, they're exact. But I was just going to say,
I saw this movie one time. Yeah.
They're all messages. It's not an actual, real, intrinsically felt kind of thing. And so then when we get to the heart of that, and we say, okay, this sense of unlovableness isn't coming intrinsically from you, then I think that it comes back to what Michael's talking about with this identity internalization. If that's not really your identity, are you willing to now challenge that and reject this idea of unlovableness in favor of some identity structure that's more congruent with what you truly see about yourself? I think for me that is the core of this idea of clarity.
The theory is that clarity is the groundwork. Earlier you mentioned should one of the goals of therapy be getting a client to know themselves, and we said ultimately it depends on what are the goals of this particular client. But that has to leave me wondering, can you do work with a client without that level of clarity? I think you do have to reach a certain point of clarity with a client, either understanding the messages that they're receiving, understanding the dialogue within themselves, understanding the propensities within themselves, and then additionally, finally, their convictions, right?
So that's a great question, Michael. My experience, the presenting problem that brings somebody to therapy is almost never the underlying problem that's causing real difficulty in their life. But if you don't appear to address the presenting problem and make progress with the presenting problem, you'll never get the opportunity to go beneath that. So it is a dance that, again, the therapist is challenged to track at an existential level and at a superficial level to keep the client secure and wanting to come back, feel good about what they're getting out of coming to therapy. And it's a real challenge sometimes.
And the idea of clarity is a spectrum, right? And so if you're doing cognitive behavior therapy, somebody comes in and says, I'm always late to work. So we're going to do cognitive behavior therapy to identify why it is that you're always late to work. And we identify all of these unconscious self-talk messages, like, oh, I have more time, or I need to eat a good breakfast, all these things. And then we modify those so that you're more on time. That really isn't getting to, oh, I was unloved as a child, but it is getting to a level of clarity that is dealing with that very specific symptomology presentation. So yes, we always are going to be working on clarity because there's just no other way to be able to do therapy. You can't get change if you don't work on that process of clarity. But my question is, are we, and I don't want to say disservice, because it always have to be with the client. But for me, psychotherapy is good, really, really foundational psychotherapy is a deeper process that does get to that point of cathexis. At least for me, that's at least a part of my goal. Now, I'm not going to force that on a client that doesn't want to go there, but I am always looking for the avenues for what helps me to clinically understand that individual's process, that process of cathexis more. What are you laughing about?
I'm sorry. When you said I'm not going to force that on the client, I flashed. I remember one time working with a family. The mother had lost her cool because she had gotten up at 4 o'clock in the morning and taken these 3 kids to Six Flags. And she wanted to ride a particular ride that they didn't want to ride. And she lost it and went into this whole diatribe about, I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I drove several hours to get here, you're going to ride every ride out here and you're goddamn going to have fun. So that's where I flashed when you said, I'm not going to push that on the client. Here's your interpretation of reality that I insist you have.
What she wanted was the recognition. She wanted recognition.
Yes, she did.
That's all she wanted.
Yeah.
But I get that.
Do they ride the ride?
Yes, and they cried the whole time.
Nobody had fun.
All right, that sounds like a good place to leave it for today. We would really love it if you would go to the YouTubes and find Psych with Mike and subscribe to the show there. You can also go on to the Apple Podcast site and find Psych with Mike and leave us a comment and a rating. That always helps people find the show, and we really appreciate that. As always, the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.